In 1932, during one of Edgar Cayce's most striking readings, a family came to him broken by confusion. Their daughter had fallen in love with someone, yet everything around them seemed to collapse. The relationship was filled with arguments, delays, and strange obstacles. When Cayce entered his trance, his words were not of judgment but of clarity. He explained that sometimes what we call love is actually the soul replaying an old pattern, one that may not lead to growth. And when God does not want you with someone, life begins to give signs, clear, painful, and unavoidable. This truth is hard to face, but Cayce emphasized that love is sacred when it helps both souls rise, not when it pulls them down. Before we go deeper into these powerful teachings, I want to invite you. If this theme speaks to your heart, leave a comment sharing if you've ever felt God blocking a relationship in your life. I'll mark your comment with a heart. And don't forget to like, share this message, and subscribe so more people can discover Cayce's wisdom. Cayce, often called the Sleeping Prophet, lived in Virginia Beach, but people traveled from across America during the Great Depression just to hear his readings. When asked about relationships, his answers were direct yet compassionate. He would say that every soul enters this world with a plan, a mission to learn and to grow. Sometimes another person is part of that mission, a partner for building a future together. But other times the person we think we need is actually a mirror of old mistakes, a bond that keeps us chained to suffering instead of moving us forward. Cayce reminded people that God, through signs in life, reveals when a union is not meant to be. These signs are not punishments, they are protections. And in the silence of prayer, one can hear the whisper of truth, that not every love is aligned with God's purpose. What are these signs? According to Cayce, the first is the loss of inner peace. Love, when it comes from the soul, brings calm even in times of hardship. But when God does not approve of a relationship, anxiety, jealousy, and fear dominate the heart. In one reading, Cayce told a young woman that the constant restlessness she felt was not just her imagination. It was her soul recognizing that the union was not aligned with her growth. He explained that God speaks through our emotions, and if a relationship steals our peace, it is a warning. Peace is not something fragile. It is the natural state of a soul walking in truth. When it disappears, we must listen carefully. The second sign Cayce pointed out is the blocking of progress. In the years of World War II, soldiers and their families came to him with questions about their future. He explained that when God blesses a union, doors open, opportunities appear, and both lives expand. But when God does not want two people together, everything begins to stall. Finances, health, even friendships. It is as if the universe itself resists. He told one couple that no matter how much effort they put in, their constant setbacks were a sign that they were forcing what was not meant to be. For Cayce, this was not a curse. It was God's protection, preventing two souls from wasting precious years in a bond that would not bear good fruit. The third sign is loss of identity. Cayce believed that every soul carries a divine spark, a unique mission. When a relationship destroys individuality, making a person forget who they are, it is a red flag. In a session that deeply moved an entire family, Cayce explained that love should never erase identity, it should magnify it. If being with someone makes you smaller, weaker, or distant from God, then that union is not guided by the divine. He taught that God does not unite people to imprison them, He unites them to expand them, and the soul always knows when it is shrinking instead of growing. The fourth sign, according to Cayce, is the constant repetition of pain. In many of his trance readings, he would uncover that certain souls met again through reincarnation, not to live a great love, but to resolve unfinished business. However, instead of healing, some people chose to repeat the same mistakes: jealousy, betrayal, or neglect. Cayce warned that when a relationship feels like an endless circle of hurt, without learning or transformation, it means the lesson is being ignored. God allows souls to meet again for redemption, but if they persist in creating suffering, He sends signs to separate them. As Cayce explained, the point of connection is growth, not endless pain. Another striking observation came during the Great Depression, when many families were on the edge of collapse. A woman asked Cayce why her marriage was filled with bitterness. Cayce's words were simple yet piercing. Where there is no growth, there is no blessing. He explained that God does not unite people to punish them, but to elevate them. If the bond only drags both souls deeper into despair, then God places obstacles to show that the time has come to let go. He urged that true love is always constructive, never destructive. This message echoed across Virginia Beach, giving hope to those who feared being trapped forever in destructive ties. A fifth sign is the distancing from God. Cayce insisted that every relationship should bring people closer to the divine. In a session in Hopkinsville, he told a young man that love is tested by whether it lifts both partners towards spiritual values or pushes them away from prayer and service. If being with someone makes a person neglect faith, abandon spiritual practices, or harden their heart against forgiveness, this is a powerful indication that God does not want that union. He described love as a bridge to the Creator. If that bridge collapses, the relationship is not aligned with the divine plan. For Cayce, faith and love were inseparable. One could not destroy the other. Cayce also explained the mysterious role of timing. Sometimes people truly belong together, but not at the wrong moment. He said that God not only decides who, but also when. A union forced before its time can bring unnecessary suffering. He compared it to planting a seed in winter. The seed is good, but the season is wrong. In one reading, he comforted a man heartbroken after separation, saying, "What is meant to be will find its hour. Trust in God's timing, for it is perfect." This perspective revealed that sometimes rejection is not final separation, but divine preparation for something better. The sixth sign is a heavy conscience. Cayce explained that when we are aligned with God's will, even difficult paths bring peace inside. But if our heart feels guilty, heavy, or constantly conflicted, it is God whispering that something is wrong. He told one seeker that ignoring conscience is like ignoring the compass of the soul. If love makes us compromise our values, abandon honesty, or go against what we know is right, then God is showing clearly, this is not the way. Conscience for Cayce was the voice of God within, a guide that never lies. Cayce's teachings invite us not to see broken relationships as failures, but as guidance. He often said that souls evolve through both unions and separations. When God closes a door, it is not cruelty, it is protection. He wanted people to see that every ending carries a seed of new beginning, that every no from heaven protects us from a greater pain we cannot yet see. And this truth is what makes his guidance so powerful for today. Love is divine only when it helps both souls grow closer to God, not when it destroys them. During the years of World War II, many soldiers and their loved ones sought Cayce's counsel. Some wanted to know if they would survive the war, others if they should marry before leaving. In one particularly emotional session, a soldier's fiancée asked if their union was truly blessed. Cayce's response was not about fear, but about clarity. He explained that if love is from God, it will strengthen both souls even in the shadow of war. But if the bond only creates confusion, fear, or weakness, then it is not the path God intends. He reminded them that divine love brings courage, not despair. His words comforted countless families who faced impossible choices during that turbulent era. Cayce often emphasized that the purpose of relationships is growth, not possession. He once told a woman that true love is not measured by how tightly you can hold someone, but by how much freer both souls become in God's light. If a relationship suffocates, manipulates, or chains one soul, then it is not divine. God does not unite people to create prisons of the heart. He unites them so both can discover greater freedom in serving and loving. When a bond becomes toxic, when trust is constantly broken, when respect is absent, Cayce taught that God often intervenes through circumstances to separate the souls. What looks like tragedy may actually be liberation. Another critical point Cayce addressed was the difference between desire and destiny. He explained that human desire can be powerful, but it is not always aligned with the soul's true path. Many people mistake desire for love, believing that intensity means divine approval. Cayce warned that desire alone can deceive, especially if it blinds a person to warning signs. He taught that destiny, God's will for the soul, always produces harmony, growth, and peace. If what we call love brings chaos, then it is desire, not destiny. And when desire fights against destiny, God will eventually win, even if it breaks our hearts in the process. In Virginia Beach, during one of his group sessions, Cayce was asked if God punishes people by separating them from who they love. His answer was profound. God does not punish, he protects. Separation may feel like punishment, but in truth, it is preservation of the soul. This redefined how many people saw heartbreak. Instead of believing they were cursed, they began to see that God's no is often a greater yes to something they cannot yet see. Cayce urged people to trust that divine love is wiser than human desire, and that no separation happens without purpose. For those who wondered how to know if God truly wanted a union, Cayce's advice was consistent. Look at the fruit. A tree is known by its fruit, and so is a relationship. Does it make you kinder, more patient? Does it push you to serve others, to live with more honesty, to walk closer to God? If yes, then the union is blessed. But if the relationship produces bitterness, jealousy, selfishness, and distance from God, then the fruit is rotten, no matter how sweet the surface may look. He taught that appearances deceive, but fruit never lies. This principle became a compass for many who struggled with difficult decisions in love. Cayce also explained that many relationships collapse because they are based on karmic debts rather than spiritual harmony. In his readings, he often revealed that two souls had shared a past life where mistakes were made, betrayals, abuse of power, neglect of love. When they met again, it was an opportunity to heal those wounds through forgiveness and growth. But sometimes, instead of healing, the souls repeated the same errors. Cayce made it clear, when a relationship constantly reopens old wounds instead of closing them, God allows separation to prevent further damage. For him, this was not failure, but progress, because even ending a destructive pattern is a step toward evolution. One of his most touching cases came during a reading for a man who could not let go of a woman who constantly mistreated him. Cayce said that clinging to a destructive love is like holding onto fire. It burns no matter how much you believe you can handle it. He explained that God sometimes allows pain only long enough for us to wake up, but once the lesson is clear, continuing the relationship is no longer growth, but stubbornness. And when we refuse to release what God wants to take away, life itself begins to collapse. Health weakens, finances fail, peace disappears. These breakdowns are not curses, but wake-up calls. Cayce reminded his seekers that love is sacred only when it reflects God's nature. In one family session, he said, "If love does not reflect patience, kindness, and truth, then it is not love, it is attachment." This distinction helped countless people see that God's plan is never to trap the soul in chains disguised as affection. True love inspires service, honesty, and forgiveness. If a relationship makes someone more selfish, bitter, or resentful, then God will not sustain it. And if people try to force it, they will face closed doors, endless conflict, and heavy hearts until they surrender to divine wisdom. He also stressed the importance of prayer and meditation in discerning relationships. Cayce often encouraged people to seek silence before making decisions of the heart. He believed that God always answers, but not through thunder or miracles, instead through inner stillness, through dreams, through quiet conviction. He once told a woman who was torn between two men, "In your prayers you already know, your soul does not lie." This was his way of saying that when God does not want us with someone, we already sense it deep inside. The real challenge is having the courage to listen. As his work expanded in the 1940s, many people began asking Cayce for direct yes or no answers about relationships. Yet he rarely gave them in black and white. Instead, he returned to the principle that God wants what makes us grow. He would say, "Ask yourself, does this love help you become more of what God made you to be?" If the answer was no, then it was clear. He knew that people often wanted certainty without effort, but God's path is discerned through reflection, not shortcuts. By placing responsibility back in the seeker's heart, Cayce empowered them to trust their inner guidance. In the post-war years, when families were rebuilding their lives and seeking new beginnings, Cayce emphasized that relationships were not just about personal happiness, but about soul development. He told seekers that when God approves a relationship, there is a sense of expansion, of two souls building something larger than themselves. This could be a family, a mission, or a shared path of service. But when God does not approve, the union becomes smaller and smaller, shrinking both lives until there is nothing left but emptiness. He warned that no matter how much two people cling to each other, if God is not in the center, the relationship will eventually collapse under its own weight. Cayce also spoke about the role of service in love. He explained that love aligned with God is never selfish. It is not about what we can extract from the other, but about how we can serve and uplift them. If a relationship is dominated by control, demands, or one-sided sacrifice, then it is not guided by the divine. God places people together to create harmony, not slavery. In one case, Cayce told a husband that his constant criticism of his wife was destroying not only the marriage, but also his own spiritual progress. He urged him to transform criticism into service, or else God would allow the union to dissolve. The message was clear: love is sustained by giving, not by taking. Another profound teaching Cayce delivered was about healing after separation. He insisted that when God removes someone from our life, it is not the end of love. It is the beginning of a higher form of love. The challenge is to forgive, release bitterness, and keep the heart open. He told one grieving woman, "Do not close your heart because of one who could not walk with you. Keep it open for the one who will." These words became a beacon of hope for many who felt abandoned. Cayce wanted people to understand that God's rejections are always redirections toward greater blessings. He also clarified that not every painful relationship is meant to be abandoned immediately. Sometimes the pain itself is a mirror showing us what we need to change within ourselves. But once the lesson is learned, once the mirror has revealed its truth, holding on becomes destructive. Cayce warned that clinging beyond the point of growth turns love into bondage. God, in His mercy, intervenes to break chains the soul refuses to release. He taught that this is why so many people experience sudden, unexpected breakups. They are moments of divine intervention, saving them from greater losses in the future. Cayce often reminded people that God's will is revealed through alignment, not resistance. When two souls are meant to walk together, the relationship flows. Even in hard times, there is a sense of shared purpose. But when God does not want that bond, resistance appears everywhere. Arguments multiply, misunderstandings deepen, and peace disappears. In a powerful reading from the early 1940s, Cayce said, "When every path turns to conflict, listen. It is not the other that must change. It is the path itself that is wrong." This insight freed many seekers from trying to fix what God never intended to last. He also emphasized the healing role of truth. Many people cling to relationships built on illusions, false promises, hidden betrayals, or unrealistic expectations. Cayce declared that truth always rises to the surface because God will not allow lies to sustain love. If a relationship collapses after the truth is revealed, it is not because love failed, it is because God removed the falsehood that was poisoning it. He insisted that truth is never the enemy. It is the light that exposes whether a bond is real or counterfeit. Another critical lesson was the importance of self-love under God. Cayce taught that when someone accepts mistreatment, believing that endurance is love, they forget their divine worth. He explained that God does not unite people so one can dominate the other. If a relationship demands the destruction of self-respect, it is not from God. In one of his later sessions, he comforted a woman who had endured years of humiliation, telling her, "You are God's child. Love that destroys dignity is not His will." For many, these words became a revelation, showing that leaving certain relationships is not rebellion, it is obedience to God's protection. As we reflect on Cayce's wisdom, one truth stands out. God does not remove people from our lives to harm us, but to prepare us for greater growth. Each sign, the loss of peace, the blocking of progress, the destruction of identity, the repetition of pain, the distancing from faith, the weight of conscience, all of them are acts of divine love. They are warnings written in the fabric of daily life, urging us to step away before we lose ourselves. Cayce wanted humanity to see that heartbreak is not the end. It is God's redirection toward a destiny aligned with the soul's purpose. So if you have ever wondered why a relationship slipped through your hands despite all your effort, remember Cayce's message. God's no is never empty. It is always a greater yes that awaits. Trust the signs, trust the protection, and above all, trust that divine love will never abandon you. And now I want to ask you, have you ever felt that God closed a door in your relationships for your own good? Share your story in the comments. I'll mark each one with a heart. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs this message, and subscribe to the channel for more revelations from the teachings of Edgar Cayce. Together, let's walk this journey of growth, guided always by divine wisdom. In one of his most striking readings from the early 1930s, Edgar Cayce warned that humanity's greatest struggle would not be fought on battlefields. He described a war of spirit, an Armageddon, where light and darkness would battle for the future of every soul. For those who heard his words, the shock was immediate. People had come to Cayce searching for cures, guidance, or answers about their personal lives, but what he delivered was a vision that stretched far beyond one person's struggles. It was a warning for humanity as a whole. In that moment, he shifted the conversation from the physical to the eternal, from temporary concerns to the destiny of the soul. And what he revealed still speaks directly to us today, because every one of us, in ways both seen and unseen, is already standing on that battlefield. Before we dive deeper, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll mark every comment with a little heart. Cayce's description of Armageddon was never about armies clashing under a sky of fire. Instead, he said the greatest battles are fought within consciousness itself. In his readings, he often reminded seekers that humanity is constantly choosing between forces that elevate the soul and those that bind it to suffering. He spoke of light as the awareness of God's presence and darkness as the forgetfulness of that connection. Armageddon, in his terms, is not somewhere out there, but a condition in which our collective choices determine the course of human history. When people think of end times, they often imagine destruction, chaos, and loss. But for Cayce, the true end was not the end of the world. It was the end of ignorance, the breaking point where humanity would be forced to awaken or collapse under the weight of its own shadows. This reframing changes everything. Instead of fearing prophecies of doom, Cayce invited us to see Armageddon as an opportunity for profound transformation. In one session that touched a family deeply, Cayce explained that the struggles they faced were reflections of the larger battle of light and darkness. What seemed like personal misfortune was also part of a collective shift, as if each individual life mirrored the condition of the world. This perspective was both unsettling and liberating. It meant that no one was exempt from the responsibility of choosing light, but it also meant that each small act of love, forgiveness, or faith contributed to the tipping of the scales. He emphasized again and again the choices made in daily life. How we treat others, how we use our thoughts, how we direct our intentions are not insignificant. They are the very weapons and shields in this spiritual war. For Cayce, Armageddon was less about prophecy and more about preparation. The preparation of the soul for alignment with divine purpose. And this preparation was not limited to saints or mystics. It was demanded of everyone. During the 1930s, people listening to Cayce were already carrying the burdens of uncertainty. Economic collapse had shaken their sense of stability, and whispers of global conflict were growing louder. It was in this climate of fear that Cayce reminded them that the most dangerous collapse was not financial or political, but spiritual. He said the true danger was when humanity abandoned its connection to God and allowed selfishness, greed, and hatred to dominate its decisions. This, he warned, was the breeding ground for darkness. Yet even as he gave these sobering warnings, Cayce offered hope. He spoke of a future in which light could prevail, not because it would crush darkness through violence, but because it would outshine it through collective awakening. He urged individuals to pray, to meditate, to live with integrity, and to extend compassion even in the smallest ways. For him, every soul was both a soldier and a prize in this battle. And in the silence of his trances, He saw that this war was already unfolding in ways too subtle for newspapers or history books to capture. Cayce often described this spiritual Armageddon as a test of humanity's collective maturity. He saw it not as punishment, but as the inevitable result of the seeds sown by human thought and action. Just as individuals must eventually face the consequences of their choices, civilizations too reach a point where they must confront what they have created. In several readings, he pointed to the growing unrest in the world as evidence that humanity was standing at a crossroads. He explained that societies built on selfishness, division, and disregard for spiritual truth would eventually collapse under their own weight. But he also reassured his listeners that collapse was not the end. It was the opportunity to rebuild on stronger foundations, guided by principles of light. The crucial factor, he emphasized, was whether people would awaken to their spiritual identity in time. This awakening would not come from fear, but from recognition that each person carries within them the spark of the divine. One of the most striking aspects of Cayce's warnings is how personal he made them. He did not simply speak of humanity in the abstract. Instead, he told individuals that their thoughts, emotions, and daily choices were threads woven into the destiny of the entire world. In one reading, he urged the seeker to understand that every act of kindness contributes to the victory of light, while every moment of resentment or hatred strengthens the darkness. This was not meant to instill guilt, but responsibility. Cayce wanted people to recognize the immense power they carried, even in the ordinary routines of life. To him, Armageddon was not fought in temples or palaces, but in kitchens, workplaces, and quiet prayers offered at night. It was in the decision to forgive rather than to condemn, to give rather than to hoard, to trust rather than to despair. Through these choices, the balance of the world was being determined, moment by moment. Cayce also warned that the forces of darkness were subtle, often hiding in the very areas where people least expected them. He said that darkness is not only found in acts of violence or obvious cruelty. More often, it creeps into the heart through indifference, complacency, or the quiet acceptance of injustice. This is why he insisted that vigilance was necessary, not against enemies outside, but against the shadows that try to nest inside our own hearts. He called for practices of prayer and meditation, not as rituals of tradition, but as tools of clarity and strength in this war. By quieting the mind and turning inward, people could align with the divine light that no darkness could overcome. In doing so, they became both warriors and beacons, shining in ways that influenced not just their own lives but the collective consciousness of the planet. For Cayce, silence was not weakness. It was the ground on which the soul gathered its strength to face the unseen battle. This teaching was radical in its simplicity. While many looked for dramatic signs of the end, Cayce reminded them that the true signs were already visible in their relationships, their communities, and the movements of their own minds. He urged people to stop waiting for an external event and instead recognize that the war of spirit was already in progress. Every moment of division, every eruption of hatred, every system built on exploitation was evidence of darkness pressing forward. But just as surely, every moment of compassion, every reconciliation, every selfless act was evidence of light prevailing. The outcome was not predetermined. It was being written in real time by humanity's collective choices. This is why Cayce's words remain urgent even today. We may not see armies on a battlefield, but the evidence of the struggle is everywhere. And if his vision was correct, the future of humanity's soul depends on which side we strengthen with our thoughts and actions. Cayce often described this spiritual Armageddon as a test of humanity's collective maturity. He saw it not as punishment, but as the inevitable result of the seeds sown by human thought and action. Just as individuals must eventually face the consequences of their choices, civilizations too reach a point where they must confront what they have created. In several readings, he pointed to the growing unrest in the world as evidence that humanity was standing at a crossroads. He explained that societies built on selfishness, division, and disregard for spiritual truth would eventually collapse under their own weight. But he also reassured his listeners that collapse was not the end. It was the opportunity to rebuild on stronger foundations, guided by principles of light. The crucial factor, he emphasized, was whether people would awaken to their spiritual identity in time. This awakening would not come from fear, but from recognition that each person carries within them the spark of the divine. One of the most striking aspects of Cayce's warnings is how personal he made them. He did not simply speak of humanity in the abstract. Instead, he told individuals that their thoughts, emotions, and daily choices were threads woven into the destiny of the entire world. In one reading, he urged the seeker to understand that every act of kindness contributes to the victory of light, while every moment of resentment or hatred strengthens the darkness. This was not meant to instill guilt, but responsibility. Cayce wanted people to recognize the immense power they carried, even in the ordinary routines of life. To him, Armageddon was not fought in temples or palaces, but in kitchens, workplaces, and quiet prayers offered at night. It was in the decision to forgive rather than to condemn, to give rather than to hoard, to trust rather than to despair. Through these choices, the balance of the world was being determined moment by moment. Cayce also warned that the forces of darkness were subtle, often hiding in the very areas where people least expected them. He said that darkness is not only found in acts of violence or obvious cruelty. More often it creeps into the heart through indifference, complacency, or the quiet acceptance of injustice. This is why he insisted that vigilance was necessary, not against enemies outside, but against the shadows that try to nest inside our own hearts. He called for practices of prayer and meditation not as rituals of tradition, but as tools of clarity and strength in this war. By quieting the mind and turning inward, people could align with the divine light that no darkness could overcome. In doing so, they became both warriors and beacons, shining in ways that influenced not just their own lives, but the collective consciousness of the planet. For Cayce, silence was not weakness. It was the ground on which the soul gathered its strength to face the unseen battle. This teaching was radical in its simplicity. While many looked for dramatic signs of the end, Cayce reminded them that the true signs were already visible in their relationships, their communities, and the movements of their own minds. He urged people to stop waiting for an external event and instead recognize that the war of spirit was already in progress. Every moment of division, every eruption of hatred, every system built on exploitation was evidence of darkness pressing forward. But just as surely, every moment of compassion, every reconciliation, every selfless act was evidence of light prevailing. The outcome was not predetermined. It was being written in real time by humanity's collective choices. This is why Cayce's words remain urgent even today. We may not see armies on a battlefield, but the evidence of the struggle is everywhere, and if his vision was correct, the future of humanity's soul depends on which side we strengthen with our thoughts and actions. In several of his readings, Cayce described Armageddon as both a prophecy and a process. He explained that it would unfold not only on a global scale, but also within the individual soul. This dual dimension was key. Humanity would see unrest in nations, shifts in the earth itself, and conflicts that seemed impossible to resolve, but beneath all of that, the true battle would be spiritual. He warned that these outer events were reflections of inner struggles, a mirror showing humanity what it had allowed to grow within. In one of his most discussed sessions, he noted that the great Armageddon will be fought in the minds of men. These words carried a profound weight. Instead of a cataclysm outside, he pointed to a war in thought, intention, and awareness. For those who listened, it meant that their inner lives were not private matters alone. They were connected to the destiny of the world. This insight shook many people who had come expecting predictions of earthquakes or wars, and instead were told the greatest danger was the state of their own consciousness. Cayce also connected this vision of Armageddon to the larger cycles of soul evolution. He often spoke of humanity as being in a stage of testing, much like a student facing the final exam after years of preparation. The lessons of patience, forgiveness, and faith that individuals had been learning throughout lifetimes were now being gathered together for a decisive moment. If enough souls chose light, the collective consciousness of the earth would shift toward a new age of harmony. If too many chose darkness, the result would be suffering and delay in humanity's spiritual progress. he was careful to emphasize that prophecy was not destiny. The readings consistently reminded seekers that free will is the determining factor. The warnings about Armageddon were not predictions carved in stone, but calls to responsibility. They were invitations to awaken and choose. And this message still echoes powerfully. The future is not fixed. It is created by what we decide individually and together each day. In his language, light was never abstract. It was the living awareness of God moving through every act of compassion, every honest prayer, every choice to serve others above oneself. Darkness, on the other hand, was not merely evil as people often imagine it. It was forgetfulness, the turning away from divine truth, the acceptance of fear and separation as ultimate reality. Cayce explained that when people live as if they are cut off from God and from each other, they feed the forces of darkness. When they remember their true identity as souls created in the image of the divine, they strengthen the forces of light. The choice, therefore, was not only moral, but metaphysical. Each thought carried energy. Each word was creative. Each action rippled outward into the unseen. Armageddon was simply the culmination of these countless choices, brought to a breaking point where the soul and humanity itself could no longer remain divided. For those who came to him during times of despair, this message was both sobering and empowering. It meant that no government, no army, no scientific breakthrough could resolve the crisis at hand if humanity did not first resolve the war within itself. But it also meant that ordinary people, often feeling powerless in the face of global events, actually held the keys to transformation. A single act of forgiveness could weigh more heavily than 1,000 acts of hatred. A community committed to prayer and service could shift the balance of darkness in ways unseen. Cayce invited each listener to stop asking when the world would change and start asking how they themselves could change. The battlefield of Armageddon was not in some distant land. It was in the heart, in the home, in the moment of decision. And he assured them that divine help was always present for those who sought it, for the light of God was never absent, only ignored. Cayce was consistent in urging people not to wait for grand events, but to begin cultivating light in the most ordinary details of daily life. In his readings, he gave simple but profound practices: prayer at sunrise to align the mind with divine purpose, meditation to quiet the restless thoughts that often feed fear, acts of service to remind the heart of its unity with others, and forgiveness as a weapon more powerful than any sword. These were not optional suggestions for a few. They were, in his view, the training ground for the soul. Each of these practices weakened the grip of darkness and allowed the presence of God to flow more freely through human life. When asked how to prepare for the trials ahead, Cayce repeatedly brought seekers back to the same truth: prepare by choosing light in every moment. He said that every soul who learns to master their inner storms contributes to calming the storms of the world. In other words, world peace begins not with treaties but with the healing of the heart. One of his most profound statements about Armageddon was that the kingdom of heaven is built one act of kindness at a time. This reframed the entire concept of prophecy. Instead of fearing a predetermined apocalypse, Cayce taught that humanity was building its future brick by brick, choice by choice. He compared the collective consciousness of humanity to a great river. Every thought, word, and action poured into it like streams of water. When people acted from love, they poured clear water. When they acted from hatred or fear, they poured mud. The river would eventually overflow, carrying whatever it contained into the future. The question was whether it would carry life or poison. This image struck listeners deeply because it made the invisible visible. It showed them that their lives mattered far beyond their own immediate circle, and that Armageddon was not an event to dread, but a call to take responsibility for the river they were helping to fill. In sessions with individuals struggling with illness or loss, Cayce would often turn their attention back to the larger battle of the spirit. He told them that physical healing was important, but even more critical was the healing of the soul. The body would one day perish, but the choices made in the heart and mind would echo in eternity. He spoke of the armor of light that every soul could wear: faith, patience, love, and service. These, he said, were stronger than any weapon and more lasting than any earthly security. People left those sessions not only with medical advice or guidance for their problems, but with a sense of mission. They felt that their personal struggles were part of something cosmic, that their suffering had meaning when offered in love, and that their victory over fear or despair was a victory for humanity as a whole. It gave them the courage to face hardships not as victims, but as participants in a divine drama. Even today, when we read these words in the archives of the ARE, the message feels uncannily relevant. The world is filled with conflict, division, and uncertainty. Many feel as if darkness is winning, yet Cayce's vision reminds us that the measure of victory is not in headlines, but in the unseen choices of the soul. The struggle of light and darkness is not over nations, but over human consciousness itself. And here lies the hope. Light does not need to destroy darkness, it only needs to shine. A single candle is enough to pierce a room full of shadows. Multiply that by millions of souls choosing light, and the course of history changes. Cayce's call was not to fear Armageddon, but to embrace it as the great opportunity to awaken. He insisted that the outcome was not fixed, that humanity's destiny was still being written, and that every person listening had a pen in their hand. The war is real, but the victory belongs to those who remember who they truly are. Cayce often looked beyond the struggle itself and spoke of what lay on the other side of Armageddon. He described a time when the consciousness of humanity would shift, when cooperation would replace conflict, and when nations would recognize their unity under God rather than their divisions. This was not a utopia born of human effort alone, but the natural outcome of aligning with divine law. He said that once the forces of darkness were exposed and overcome in the hearts of people, light would flood the earth in ways never seen before. He envisioned a future where spiritual truth would no longer be hidden or denied, but lived openly in every aspect of human life: education, medicine, government, and community. For many, these promises sounded almost impossible. Yet Cayce reminded them that every great transformation in history was once considered impossible until people chose differently. The same, he said, was true for this battle. Victory would not come suddenly, but as the accumulation of millions of daily choices for light. In one reading that deeply moved those present, Cayce explained that the triumph of light would not appear first in global institutions, but in the renewal of the individual heart. Families that once lived in conflict would discover peace through forgiveness. Communities divided by suspicion would rediscover unity through service. Nations exhausted by war would turn to healing rather than conquest. He did not promise perfection, but a decisive shift, a tipping point in consciousness where the scales would no longer be dominated by fear. To him, this was the true meaning of prophecy, not predicting doom but preparing for possibility. He told seekers that if enough souls chose light, the prophecies of destruction could be softened, even transformed. Free will, he emphasized, is the hand that writes the future. And with that truth, he placed the responsibility directly in the hands of those listening. No one could say they had no part to play. Everyone was a participant in the destiny of the world. The power of Cayce's words rests in their balance of warning and hope. He never minimized the seriousness of the struggle. He acknowledged that darkness was real, that suffering was real, that humanity could destroy itself if it persisted in greed, division, and ignorance. But he also pointed with equal force to the reality of light, reminding people that no darkness is permanent, and that every shadow is scattered by even the smallest ray of truth. This dual vision kept his message from being dismissed as either naive optimism or empty fear-mongering. Instead, it carried the weight of reality. Life is hard, choices matter, and the struggle is ongoing, but also the certainty that light is stronger than darkness if we choose it. For those who sat in his presence in Hopkinsville, Virginia Beach, or other places where he gave readings, the impact was unforgettable. They left not with despair, but with a burning sense of mission, to live as bearers of light in a world that desperately needed it. That mission extends to us today. The Armageddon Cayce described is not finished. The evidence of the struggle is in the news, in our communities, and even in our own minds. Each time fear rises, each time hatred tempts, each time despair whispers that nothing can change, we are standing at the crossroads he spoke of. And each time we choose faith over fear, compassion over hatred and hope over despair, we tip the balance toward light. In one of his most striking readings from the early 1930s, Edgar Cayce warned that humanity's greatest struggle would not be fought on battlefields. He described a war of spirit, an Armageddon, where light and darkness would battle for the future of every soul. For those who heard his words, the shock was immediate. People had come to Cayce searching for cures, guidance, or answers about their personal lives, but what he delivered was a vision that stretched far beyond one person's struggles. It was a warning for humanity as a whole. In that moment, he shifted the conversation from the physical to the eternal, from temporary concerns to the destiny of the soul. And what he revealed still speaks directly to us today. Because every one of us, in ways both seen and unseen, is already standing on that battlefield. Before we dive deeper, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll mark every comment with a little heart. Cayce's description of Armageddon was never about armies clashing under a sky of fire. Instead, he said the greatest battles are fought within consciousness itself. In his readings, he often reminded seekers that humanity is constantly choosing between forces that elevate the soul and those that bind it to suffering. He spoke of light as the awareness of God's presence and darkness as the forgetfulness of that connection. Armageddon, in his terms, is not somewhere out there, but a condition in which our collective choices determine the course of human history. When people think of end times, they often imagine destruction, chaos, and loss. But for Cayce, the true end was not the end of the world. It was the end of ignorance, the breaking point where humanity would be forced to awaken or collapse under the weight of its own shadows. This reframing changes everything. Instead of fearing prophecies of doom, Cayce invited us to see Armageddon as an opportunity for profound transformation. In one session that touched a family deeply, Cayce explained that the struggles they faced were reflections of the larger battle of light and darkness. What seemed like personal misfortune was also part of a collective shift, as if each individual life mirrored the condition of the world. This perspective was both unsettling and liberating. It meant that no one was exempt from the responsibility of choosing light, but it also meant that each small act of love, forgiveness, or faith contributed to the tipping of the scales. He emphasized again and again the choices made in daily life. How we treat others, how we use our thoughts, how we direct our intentions are not insignificant. They are the very weapons and shields in this spiritual war. For Cayce, Armageddon was less about prophecy and more about preparation, the preparation of the soul for alignment with divine purpose. And this preparation was not limited to saints or mystics. It was demanded of everyone. During the 1930s, people listening to Cayce were already carrying the burdens of uncertainty. Economic collapse had shaken their sense of stability, and whispers of global conflict were growing louder. It was in this climate of fear that Cayce reminded them that the most dangerous collapse was not financial or political, but spiritual. He said the true danger was when humanity abandoned its connection to God and allowed selfishness, greed, and hatred to dominate its decisions. This, he warned, was the breeding ground for darkness. Yet even as he gave these sobering warnings, Cayce offered hope. He spoke of a future in which light could prevail, not because it would crush darkness through violence, but because it would outshine it through collective awakening. He urged individuals to pray, to meditate, to live with integrity, and to extend compassion even in the smallest ways. For him, every soul was both a soldier and a prize in this battle. And in the silence of his trances, he saw that this war was already unfolding in ways too subtle for newspapers or history books to capture. Cayce often described this spiritual Armageddon as a test of humanity's collective maturity. He saw it not as punishment, but as the inevitable result of the seeds sown by human thought and action. Just as individuals must eventually face the consequences of their choices, civilizations too reach a point where they must confront what they have created. In several readings, he pointed to the growing unrest in the world as evidence that humanity was standing at a crossroads. He explained that societies built on selfishness, division, and disregard for spiritual truth would eventually collapse under their own weight. But he also reassured his listeners that collapse was not the end. It was the opportunity to rebuild on stronger foundations, guided by principles of light. The crucial factor, he emphasized, was whether people would awaken to their spiritual identity in time. This awakening would not come from fear, but from recognition that each person carries within them the spark of the divine. One of the most striking aspects of Cayce's warnings is how personal he made them. He did not simply speak of humanity in the abstract. Instead, he told individuals, they said dreams are only illusions of the mind. But Edgar Cayce challenged that idea in ways that left even skeptics speechless. In one of his documented sessions in 1932, Cayce explained that dreams could be the very language of the soul, a channel through which God speaks directly to us. Now imagine this: you wake up from a dream so vivid, so powerful, that it feels more real than your waking life. Could that be a divine call? Today we will uncover 7 recurring dream symbols Cayce described that might mean God himself is reaching out to you. These are not inventions or myths. They are based on cases recorded, preserved in the archives of the ARE in Virginia Beach, where every reading was carefully documented. And before we begin, I invite you, if you feel touched by this message, support this community. Like this video, share it with someone who needs guidance, and leave a comment telling me if you have ever had a dream that felt like a calling. I will heart every comment because your experience matters here. During the Great Depression, when hopelessness filled American homes, Cayce gave readings that brought light in the darkest nights. Many came to him not only for health or financial advice, but for meaning. Again and again, he pointed to dreams as the bridge between the human soul and the divine. In those dreams, people found symbols that repeated, light that could not be described, water flowing in endless streams, voices speaking not in words, but in a vibration that shook the heart. Cayce said these were not random. They carried profound spiritual meaning. If you experience such a dream, it could mean your soul is being called to awaken. What Cayce emphasized was that these signs had to be lived, not just admired. They required action, a step closer to God, a deeper surrender to Christ. And that is why understanding these dreams is not curiosity, it is responsibility. Because missing the call could mean missing your true purpose in this lifetime. When Cayce entered trance, he described the dream world as an entry into the Akashic records, a universal memory field where every soul's journey is inscribed. From there, symbols emerged tailored to each seeker. But some patterns were universal. One of the most striking cases came during a session that transformed an entire family in Hopkinsville. The dream described was of standing before a great body of water, calm yet infinite. Cayce explained that water symbolized the flow of spirit, the eternal presence of God calling the dreamer into trust. It was not coincidence, it was not imagination, it was the Creator reaching out. Another recurring symbol was light, brighter than the sun, surrounding the dreamer without burning. Cayce said this was the unmistakable presence of the divine, a direct reminder of God's calling. If you have dreamed of overwhelming light, this could be one of those unmistakable signs. And what followed for that family was transformation. They reconnected with their faith, renewed their hope, and rebuilt their lives after financial ruin. Skeptics asked, how can a dream change reality? Yet the evidence was undeniable. People acted on those messages and their lives shifted. One man who dreamed of a door opening in silence came to Cayce for guidance. He was told the door symbolized a new spiritual opportunity, an invitation to answer God's call. The man left his old life behind, chose service over wealth, and discovered peace he had never known. Over and over, Cayce showed that dreams were not entertainment of the mind, but the soul's way of reminding us of our mission. The dreams that come with divine symbols do not fade easily. They stay with you, pressing on your heart, urging you to act. And that is why in this video we explore 7 of these powerful dreams. Each one carries weight. Each one could be the moment God calls your name. Stay with me, because before the end of this journey you will see dreams in a way you never imagined before. One of the first dream patterns Cayce often highlighted was the dream of radiant light. This was not ordinary light, not sunlight or a lamp. It was a brilliance beyond description, filling the dreamer with peace and awe. In a 1934 reading, Cayce explained that such light symbolized the direct presence of God and the assurance that the dreamer was being called into a higher path. People who experienced this dream frequently woke with tears, unable to forget the intensity. For Cayce, the message was clear. If the dream leaves you with overwhelming clarity and warmth, it is not just a dream. It is God reminding you of your true purpose. He insisted that those who ignored such dreams often felt restless until they embraced the call to prayer, service, or healing others. The light was not meant to impress, but to guide, to realign life with divine intention. A second recurring symbol was the presence of water, whether rivers, oceans, or fountains. In a session during the war years, Cayce explained that water represented the flow of spirit and renewal of the soul. When people dreamed of crossing water, it often indicated a transition in their spiritual life, moving from doubt to faith, from isolation to connection with God. One woman dreamed of walking through a great storm, only to find herself on the shore of a calm sea. Cayce interpreted this as a direct sign that God was calling her out of a life of fear into a life of faith. Soon after, she chose to dedicate herself to teaching and guiding children, a decision that gave her new meaning during the darkest times of the 1940s. Cayce's point was simple yet profound. When water flows in your dreams, ask yourself what spiritual crossing you are being invited to make. A third dream symbol Cayce often emphasized was encounters with biblical figures or messengers. He said these were not hallucinations of the subconscious, but real encounters in the soul's dimension. Figures like Christ, angels, or even prophets appeared not to frighten, but to awaken. One of the most powerful examples came from a reading where a man described meeting a shining figure who silently handed him a book. Cayce revealed that the figure was a representation of the Christ consciousness, and the book symbolized the soul's mission waiting to be fulfilled. For that man, the dream ignited a journey of faith that reshaped his family's life. Cayce warned that such encounters should never be ignored because they meant a direct call from God to listen and obey. Dreams of this kind are among the clearest forms of divine communication. The fourth pattern Cayce described was dreams of death and rebirth. To the untrained eye, these seemed frightening: coffins, funerals, or endings. But Cayce explained they rarely predicted physical death. Instead, they symbolized the death of an old way of life and the birth of a new spiritual chapter. A person might dream of attending their own funeral, only to awaken with a profound sense of peace. Cayce said this was God's way of telling them to leave behind destructive habits and step into a new calling. He referenced multiple cases where dreamers experienced this and soon after made life-altering changes, abandoning addictions, repairing broken relationships, or embracing service. These dreams were less about loss and more about invitation, an invitation to be transformed, to answer God's call by becoming a new creation in Christ. The fifth symbol Cayce described was the dream of voices without form. These were not ordinary conversations or random sounds. They were clear, commanding, and often repeated until the dreamer paid attention. Cayce explained that when a dream carried a voice speaking truth directly to the heart, it often meant God was calling the soul to awaken. In one documented case, a woman repeatedly heard the words, "Follow me," in her sleep. She had never been religious, but Cayce revealed that this was no coincidence. It was the Christ consciousness urging her toward a path of service. Weeks later, she felt compelled to dedicate her life to helping wounded soldiers during the war. Cayce warned that ignoring such dreams could lead to spiritual unrest because the voice would continue until the message was received. These voices were not meant to scare, but to direct, a reminder that God often speaks in ways that bypass human logic. The sixth recurring dream involved doors, gates, or pathways opening. Cayce often emphasized that whenever someone dreamed of walking through a door of light or standing before a gate, it represented a spiritual opportunity. In one of his 1932 readings, a man described dreaming of countless doors lined up in a hallway, with only one opening into radiant brightness. Cayce explained that this was God's way of showing him that although life offered many choices, only one aligned with divine purpose. When the man acted on that dream, choosing to abandon dishonest business practices, he found peace and prosperity that he had never known. For Cayce, These symbols were crucial. Doors were not just doors, they were invitations. Gates were not obstacles, they were transitions. If you dream of such openings, Cayce urged, ask yourself, what new calling is God placing in front of me, and am I ready to walk through? Finally, the seventh dream that Cayce identified as deeply significant was the dream of journeys, traveling by road, train, or even flight. He explained that these dreams symbolized the progression of the soul through stages of growth. One case from Virginia Beach described a man dreaming of boarding a train that never seemed to stop, carrying him toward a bright horizon. Cayce interpreted this as God's call for him to remain faithful through a long season of preparation before reaching his life's mission. In other cases, dreams of flying represented the soul rising above earthly struggles, being lifted into higher spiritual awareness. For Cayce, these journeys were not random. They reminded the dreamer that their life path was part of something greater, that God was actively directing each step. When such dreams repeated, it was the soul's way of saying, do not resist. Your journey is already unfolding under divine guidance. Now with these 7 patterns, light, water, messengers, death and rebirth, voices, doors and journeys, Cayce showed that dreams were not illusions, but invitations. They were God's fingerprints on the human soul, calling us to awaken, to remember and to respond. If you have ever had one of these dreams, perhaps this is the time to reflect. What is God asking of you? What step is your soul waiting for you to take? Before we close, I want to invite you once more. If this message resonates, show your support by liking this video, sharing it with someone searching for answers, and subscribing to this channel for more revelations grounded in the readings of Edgar Cayce. Leave a comment describing the dream that most marked your life, and I will heart every single comment, because your experiences are what bring these truths alive. During the years of the Great Depression, countless families faced hunger, fear, and the collapse of everything they trusted. In that time, Edgar Cayce's readings gave hope where none seemed possible. People would travel to Virginia Beach or write desperate letters from across the nation, searching for answers. Many of those answers came through dreams. Cayce explained that while the world outside was falling apart, God was still speaking inwardly, in visions during the night. One woman, for example, told Cayce she dreamed of walking into a house with endless rooms, some bright with light, others dark and empty. Cayce revealed that this was her soul being shown the choices before her, to remain trapped in fear or to step into the rooms filled with divine presence. For her, this was not theory, it was survival. She chose faith, and in the years that followed, she became a beacon of hope for her community, guiding others through prayer circles and acts of service. Her story became a reminder that in times of crisis, God often speaks through dreams to keep our hearts steady. As World War II spread across continents, soldiers and their families also came to Cayce with haunting dreams. One man, stationed far from home, described a recurring vision of crossing a narrow bridge, while shadows tried to pull him down. In trance, Cayce explained that the bridge symbolized his path of faith, and the shadows were his fears of death and loss. He reassured the soldier that the dream was not predicting disaster, but urging him to trust God's protection. That soldier survived battles that claimed many around him, and when he returned, he testified that the dream had given him courage each night to face the day. Stories like these filled the ARE archives, showing that the divine call through dreams was not abstract. It was practical, life-saving guidance. Cayce insisted that these dreams were given not only to comfort, but to direct lives toward higher service and spiritual awakening. Another striking example came from a family in Kentucky. A young boy repeatedly dreamed of a man dressed in white, placing his hand on the boy's chest. The parents were frightened, thinking it might mean illness or even death. But Cayce, when consulted, explained that the figure represented divine healing and a reminder that the child's life was meant for service. Indeed, the boy later grew up to dedicate himself to ministry and community aid, fulfilling what his dream had foreshadowed. Cayce reminded the parents that not every dream should be taken literally. Symbols were God's way of teaching through the language of the soul. Light, water, doors and journeys each carried meaning, but above all, it was the feeling left behind, peace, urgency or calling, that revealed the dream's true source. If the dream lifted the soul closer to God, Cayce said, it was never to be ignored. Skeptics often challenged Cayce, arguing that dreams were simply the brain's way of processing random memories. But Cayce countered with evidence. People acted on their dreams, and transformation followed. He did not dismiss psychology. He acknowledged the subconscious mind. But he insisted that the soul was larger than the brain. Dreams, he said, were the soul's natural way of communicating with God and receiving guidance. This was not mere speculation. Time and again, Cayce's interpretations gave clarity, and the results were visible. People changed their lives, restored broken families, and found purpose. That is why he urged everyone to keep a dream journal, to write down their visions upon waking, and to ask for divine clarity in prayer. He believed that if people prayed sincerely before sleep, their dreams could become a sacred channel of revelation. It was not superstition, it was practice, and countless seekers found that when they followed his advice, their nights became filled with meaning that spilled into their days. Cayce also emphasized that dreams often served as warnings when a person drifted too far from their spiritual path. In one of his most referenced cases, a businessman from New York dreamed of being trapped in a collapsing building with no way out. Disturbed, he sought Cayce's guidance. While in trance, Cayce explained that the building symbolized the man's crumbling moral foundation. He had compromised his integrity for financial gain, and God was calling him back through a terrifying but merciful dream. If he ignored it, Cayce warned, the collapse would move from symbolic to real. That consultation changed the man's life. He abandoned corrupt deals, chose honesty, and eventually rebuilt his business on principles of service. This story was preserved in the ARE, records as proof that even frightening dreams can be divine calls to correction. They are not punishments, but opportunities, reminders that the soul must not lose sight of God. Another layer Cayce revealed was that dreams were deeply personal. No two people carried the same symbols in exactly the same way. A river for one dreamer might represent healing, while for another, it meant the passage of time and the urgency to act. Yet across hundreds of readings, Cayce found that the 7 categories we explored, light, water, messengers, death and rebirth, voices, doors and journeys, returned again and again as universal signs of God's presence. These symbols crossed boundaries of culture, age and circumstance. They appeared to farmers in Kentucky, to soldiers overseas, to mothers praying for their children, and to seekers searching for meaning in the cities. Each time Cayce pointed back to the same truth. God was calling. The question was not whether the call was real, but whether the dreamer would answer. In the modern world, many dismiss dreams as irrelevant. We rush to our phones upon waking, flooding our minds with noise before listening to the quiet message that might have been left in the night. Cayce warned against this long before smartphones existed. He encouraged people to take a moment each morning to write down even fragments of their dreams, trusting that with time, patterns would emerge. Those patterns, he explained, could be the map of the soul's journey. Today, with science exploring the subconscious and psychology validating the power of symbols, Cayce's insights appear more relevant than ever. He stood at the intersection of faith and science, reminding us that dreams were not in conflict with reason. They were deeper than reason, a union of the soul with its creator. To ignore them was to ignore a part of ourselves that longed for God. And perhaps this is why Cayce remains so respected. He never claimed the messages came from his own wisdom. He always pointed to God, to Christ, to the universal source of truth. He was humble, often reluctant to share, but he obeyed because he knew lives depended on it. For him, dreams were sacred ground. They were not fortune-telling or entertainment. They were invitations to transformation. And today, nearly a century later, his words still echo with urgency. If you dream of light, of water, of death and rebirth, of voices or doors or journeys, ask yourself not, what does this mean in theory, but what is God asking of me right now? Because those who listened often discovered healing, courage and purpose they never imagined. The call is not distant. It is already in your sleep, waiting for you to awaken. As Cayce reminded again and again, The greatest tragedy was not that people lacked guidance, it was that they ignored it. Dreams, he explained, were God's gift of direction, given freely to every soul, regardless of wealth, education, or status. In Virginia Beach during the post-war years, Cayce often met individuals who admitted they had dismissed their dreams for decades, yet when they finally listened, their lives shifted dramatically. One man dreamed of standing before a tree with branches reaching endlessly upward. Cayce revealed that the tree represented his soul's connection to God, and that ignoring it had left him spiritually malnourished. When he embraced prayer and meditation, his dreams grew richer, his health improved, and his family testified that he became a different man. For Cayce, this was the essence. God was calling not through thunder or spectacle, but through the silent language of dreams. And every ignored dream was a missed opportunity to align with divine purpose. Think of your own life. Have you ever awakened from a dream that stayed with you all day, stirring something deep inside you? Cayce urged people never to shrug those moments off. Whether it was light so intense it felt holy, a voice that carried impossible authority, or a journey that seemed endless, those dreams carried weight. He reminded seekers that the Bible itself was filled with divine messages delivered in dreams. Joseph guiding Egypt, Daniel interpreting visions, the wise men warned not to return to Herod. For Cayce, these were not ancient myths, but living patterns. God still speaks this way. The question is, are we listening? If even one of the 7 dream patterns we explored has touched your life, it may not be coincidence. It may be the Creator himself, reaching into your night to redirect your day. And if so, the time to respond is now, not tomorrow. Cayce's message also carried responsibility. He warned that once a person recognized a divine call, they had to act. Ignoring it could lead to inner conflict, restlessness, or even illness. But obeying it brought peace beyond understanding. One woman shared that after years of recurring dreams of standing at a closed door, she finally realized it was God calling her to forgive someone she had hated for decades. When she obeyed, the dream stopped, and her spirit was released. Cayce saw this as evidence that God's voice would continue knocking until the soul opened. He often quoted scripture to remind his listeners, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." For him, dreams were often that knock, gentle but persistent. They were the echo of eternity within the fragile frame of human sleep. To treat them lightly was to miss the sacred opportunity they carried. So as we close this journey together, consider what your own nights have been whispering. Are you being called through light that refuses to fade, water that flows endlessly, voices that will not be silenced, doors that stand waiting, or journeys that never end? Edgar Cayce's legacy is not just about the past, it is about your present, your choices, and your destiny. God may already be calling you, and your dreams may be the evidence. Listen carefully. Respond courageously. And if this message has spoken to you, join this community by liking this video, sharing it with those you love, and subscribing for more truths from the documented readings of Edgar Cayce. Leave a comment telling me which dream has most marked your life, and I will heart every single one because your story matters and will inspire others to awaken as well. Together, we are not just viewers, we are seekers, walking the path of divine calling.